Attention to orders. This week's Killed in Action. 2 U.S. Navy pilots lost their lives in a crash in an F-18 on a training mission just offshore of Key West Naval Station in Florida. They are Lieutenant Commander James Johnson and Lieutenant Caleb King. It's also reported that just today, 7 American soldiers lost their lives in a helicopter crash in Iraq near the Syrian border. Please keep them and their families in your thoughts and prayers. Oklahoma, Indiana veterans. Conrad Jamiki, U.S. Air Force, World War II, POW. Paul Stanford, U.S. Navy, World War II. Roy Smith, U.S. Army, Vietnam. Richard Bricefield, U.S. Army. Devin Wolft, U.S. Army. James Jamaica, U.S. Marines. Marvin Kessling, U.S. Army Reserve. David Gehring, U.S. Marines, Korea. Todd Jenkins, U.S. Army. Maurice Amaro, U.S. Army, Korea. Russell James, U.S. Air Force. James Woodmans, U.S. Air Force. Wesley Darding, U.S. Coast Guard. Max Ketchum, U.S. Marines, Vietnam. Carl Voigt, U.S. Navy, World War II. Daniel Free, U.S. Air Force. William Pocock, U.S. Army. Floyd Kirtland, U.S. Army, Korea. Leonard Smith, U.S. Navy and U.S. Army. Thomas Howard, U.S. Army, Korea. Vernon Melton, U.S. Navy. Roy Kraft, U.S. Air Force. Theodore Huff, U.S. Navy, World War II. Everett Crone, U.S. Navy, World War II and Korea. Jeremiah Overt, U.S. Army, World War II. Russell Bond, U.S. Army. George Anderson, U.S. Army. Richard Bricefield, U.S. Army. Wilson Keel, U.S. Army, World War II. Andy Panko, U.S. Navy, World War II. Buddy Sheets, U.S. Marine Reserve, Vietnam. Darrell Hill, U.S. Army. Melvin Schwartz, U.S. Navy, World War II. James Sprague, U.S. Army. Billy Grider, U.S. Army. Charles Hicks, U.S. Army. Don Harshman, U.S. Army, Korea. Ron Huddleston, U.S. Army. Walter Tedrow, U.S. Army, Korea. Chester Farbach, U.S. Army, World War II. Edward Ashley, U.S. Army, World War II and Korea. Charles Fultz, U.S. Army. Claire Davenport, U.S. Army, Korea. Michael Yeoman, U.S. Army. Harold Doe, U.S. Army Air Corps, World War II. William Harrell, U.S. Navy, Korea. Thomas Howard, U.S. Army, Korea. Todd Jenkins, U.S. Army. Virgil Davies, U.S. Army. L.B. Biles, U.S. Navy. Carl Newton, U.S. Army. John Blockenhurst, U.S. Army, Vietnam. Leroy Jackson, U.S. Army. Stephen Zimmerman, U.S. Air Force, Korea. Gerald Betchel, U.S. Air Force, Vietnam and Desert Storm. Joseph Miller, U.S. Air Force, Korea. Clifford Dolick, U.S. Army, Korea. Kenneth Grimm, U.S. Army. James Elliott, U.S. Navy, Vietnam. James Crook, U.S. Army, World War II. Veterans around the nation. Edward Stunch, U.S. Army. Robert Galvin, U.S. Army. Jim Quinn, U.S. Air Force. James Thomason, U.S. Army, World War II and Korea. William Pless, U.S. Army, Korea. Donald Wall, U.S. Navy, Vietnam. Joseph Inskitch, U.S. Navy. Michael Reiser, U.S. Army. Gary Newell, U.S. Air Force, Korea. Mark Ely, U.S. Army, Vietnam. Franklin Dirtle, U.S. Air Force. Police and Fire, killed in the line of duty. Officer Gregory Kalalis, Panama Police Department, California. Deputy David Sean Manning, Edgecombe County Sheriff's Office, North Carolina. Reserve Officer Christopher Layton, Zachary Police Department, Louisiana. Officer Scott Hamilton, Pikeville Police Department, Kentucky. Robert Allen Huffman, Madison Township Fire Department, Ohio. And Canine Officer Eco, Davis County Sheriff's Department, Iowa. Rosie the Riveters, Mary Balagza, Anna Benton, Elizabeth Boner, Louise Burns, Sarah Craig, Ramona Dickinson, Phyllis Gawatsky, Julia Kanatsky, Cruz Leal, Adele Maurer, Alice O'Connor, Doris O'Neill, Etta Picnic, Gloria Ranker, Bernice Regna, Helen Richards, and Chloe Wakaki. POWs recently recovered. Marine Corps Reserve PFC Manuel Menendez, 20 of Elizabethtown, New Jersey. Killed missing in action November 20th, 1943. In Tarawa Atoll. Was buried unknown in 1949, exhumed 2016, and identified March of this year. Marine Corporal Private George Patrick, 22 of Dallas, Texas. Killed missing in action November 20th, 1943. Buried unknown 1949, exhumed 2016, and identified March of this year. Army Sergeant First Class Harry Harkness, 22 of Lansing, Michigan. Died as a POW in 1951 in North Korea. Remains returned December 21st, 1993, and identified March of this year.